glomerular structure, which includes the glomerular capillaries. We were talking about how those capillaries are encapsulated in the glomerular capsule, and then if we apply enough pressure into those capillaries, we're going to be pushing substances out of them. So let me pull up a picture here. We're going to be pushing substances out of them, and that will be potentially our waste, which will enter the proximal convoluted tubule. We talked about how we had to have a significant amount of pressure, much greater than a typical capillary, and that was to overcome these two pressures, which we're working against. One of those is the capillary pressure, which is just essentially the pressure inside this little sphere. And then the colloid osmotic pressure was the attraction of the water that collects in the sphere back to the blood, because the proteins are very highly concentrated inside that blood vessel. And so we get osmosis that we're working against. So 32 and 18 minus the 60 gave us what we called our net filtration pressure. So that's the net amount of force pushing things out of the capillary. And then we quickly went into glomerular filtration rate, which is we take that force and we couple that with the K of F, which was basically essentially the permeability and the size of the membrane. It's the filter size. And we said that a man, for example, has on average larger kidneys, and therefore they're filtering more blood per day. And women having slightly smaller kidneys on average will filter a little bit less. But to determine how much anybody filters per day is just that net filtration pressure, which again averages out to 10 for most people under most conditions, and the K of F, which roughly represents the total membrane space, or we can think of it as the size of their kidneys, all of their nephrons combined, gives us how many liters of fluid are filtered out of a kidney per day. 180 for men and 150 for a female. So that is kind of our average. And so we can think about circumstances that might affect that filtration process. And a lot of this can be summarized as either a variable that affects the K of F or a variable that affects the NFP, because it's the only two things that go into the calculation. So if we're thinking about glomerular filtration rates, the GFR, they are going to be things that affect the net filtration pressure or the K of F. An example of something that might affect the K of F would be like kidney disease, something that actually causes loss of kidney tissue. Maybe we start losing nephrons because of some particular condition. Or, on the other side, something that would affect glomerular filtration rate on the NFP would maybe just be something like hypertension. If you have high blood pressure, you're going to have difficulty controlling that net filtration pressure. So the kidney has to work very hard, and the body in general has to work very hard at trying to maintain those filtration rates, even if something changes back here. So that's what we were last talking about, the kidney, and as you'll see, other mechanisms that try to maintain that filtration rate, even if other variables are changing. So that's where we got into these different mechanisms: renal autoregulation, which is the only one that we have discussed but we haven't completed, and then sympathetic control and hormonal control. We started talking about one of the ways by which, I think we actually touched on in a second, but one of the ways by which we control the filtration rate is by simply constricting or relaxing the afferent arteriole. So just to sketch this out again real quick as I can. So there's my blood vessel. And if I now encapsulate this thing, I've got my glomerular capsule and the beginning of my proximal convoluted tubule here, so waste is headed that direction. Flow pattern, we'll do it this way. Afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole. So I need a total pressure, on average, of about 10 millimeters of mercury pushing fluid out. So if I have high blood pressure, what that will do is it will cause my afferent arteriole to swell just a little bit, all right? Just like a garden hose, if you turn on the hose, you can kind of see it pop into shape, right, as it begins to fill with pressure. So if I have high blood pressure, my afferent arteriole will expand a little bit. Now, if that happens, then my net filtration pressure will have to go up as well, right? So in other words, if my body's blood pressure goes up, and I don't do anything, then my net filtration pressure will have to go up also. They are directly related to one another. If my NFP goes up, then my glomerular filtration rate will have to go up, because NFP times K of F is how I get to that glomerular filtration rate. If that goes up, then of course that goes up. It's just math, multiplied across. So what if I don't want that to change? I don't want my glomerular filtration rate to go up, even though my body's blood pressure is going up. Well, when that afferent arteriole expands, it causes the smooth muscle that surrounds that blood vessel to contract. So as I have systemic high blood pressure, it stretches my afferent arteriole, and smooth muscle cells that surround it detect that, and they just squeeze back down. So they squeeze down and kind of constrict it back down. And so therefore, my net filtration pressure stays constant, even though I might have a changing systemic blood pressure outside of the capillary. Just the opposite. If for whatever reason I have significant drops in blood pressure, well then my net filtration pressure will also drop. And so therefore, my glomerular filtration rate will drop. And that means I'm filtering out less metabolic waste from the bloodstream. So I don't want that to occur either. So if my systemic blood pressure drops, then I will do just the opposite. I will relax that blood vessel, and I will let more blood in to maintain the pressure that's necessary to keep my glomerular filtration rate where I need it. So that is what we call the myogenic mechanism. Myo in reference to muscle here. So the myogenic mechanism is simply the afferent arteriole detecting either increases or decreases in pressure outside of the kidney, and then either constricting or relaxing based on what we need to happen. If the blood pressure outside the kidney is going up, then we constrict. If the blood pressure outside the kidney is dropping, then we relax. So that was the myogenic mechanism. Questions there before we tackle the tubuloglomerular feedback system? And I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was a recap, right? We did talk about that last week. Okay. And, we're in no rush today. My afternoon class was a day and a half behind you guys. So, I'm going to go slowly, and then maybe even end a little bit early today, try to pull you guys back up to about the same spot. You guys are ahead of them in terms of where they're at in lecture compared to where we're at in here in lecture. Okay, so before we go on, any questions about that system? All right, let's go to the tubuloglomerular feedback system. So I'm going to draw a smaller version of that over here. All right, so that's my proximal convoluted tubule, and we ought to know now that it takes a dip down, right, and becomes the loop of Henle, but eventually it comes back up. And when it comes back up, it passes by the entry point here. So the loop becomes the distal convoluted tubule, and the distal convoluted tubule passes by the blood vessels that enter and exit the glomerular capsule. And so there could be things that affect my GFR, and again, my GFR is my output, that aren't a consequence of what's going on with that blood vessel, right? So high blood pressure, low blood pressure are going to affect how much stretching and relaxing I get here, and that could influence my GFR, but there could be other things contributing to fluid amounts, either into or perhaps even out of, right? There could be other things that are affecting how much fluid is in this tube past this point. So I have a group of cells that are basically monitoring how much fluid is moving through the entire system. So they're monitoring the GFR kind of just outside these afferent and efferent blood vessels. And basically it works this way. If they determine that GFR is too low, well then they will send commands to a couple of different cell groups in here to try to correct it. So let's think about how we correct a GFR that is too low. Well, we've already seen one way back here. We can, if my GFR is low, I can dilate my afferent arteriole. Right? The more, basically we should just know, the more blood I let in, the more fluid I'm going to get out. Right? So that's one way that I can compete. So let's go with, let's start at the bottom and work our way back to the top. The bottom is a little bit more straightforward. It says here, the macula relaxes afferent arterioles and mesangial cells. We're going to simplify that. What it's saying there, and there are some cells that we're not going to worry about in terms of name and structure, but it's basically saying that we've talked about the podocytes. There are cells that are in here. There's other cells that are in here as well that squeeze and relax on my capillaries. The take-home message here is that if I detect too low of GFR, I want to make sure that my afferent blood vessel dilates, that I increase the diameter of it, right? And we just said that if I dilate this in any way, if I relax the pressure on that afferent arteriole, I'll get more inflow, and therefore I will get more GFR. So for a GFR that is too low, even though I have some specific names of cell types here, we're going to kind of get to the nuts and bolts of this. For a GFR that is too low, detected here in the distal convoluted tubule, commands will be sent to the capillary to relax, increasing flow, therefore increasing GFR. So that's if GFR is too low. So jump to GFR if it's too high. Any questions? So I'm skipping, don't have to worry about mesangial cells, macula, the terminology here. It's not what I'm concerned with. It's the concept that I want you to understand. Questions there? Similarly, we're going to nix most of the content that's under GFR rises. We're just going to focus on the concept. So there's mention of adenosine, there's mention of juxtaglomerular cells. Here's what I need you to know for if GFR rises. Just the opposite, basically. If we determine that the GFR is too high, commands will be sent not necessarily to the afferent arteriole, but to the capillaries themselves to constrict. And just like, I mean, you can imagine a water balloon with a little pinhole in it, right? If I squeeze on that water balloon, water's going to come shooting out at a much faster rate. So if the GFR is too high, commands will be sent to the glomerular capillaries to reduce their diameter, to squeeze. And therefore more fluid will come out and GFR will come back up. So the basic difference between the myogenic mechanism that we looked at previously and the juxtaglomerular method is that I'm affecting with the myogenic, oops, we're not ready for that one yet, sorry. I'm affecting the afferent arterial with the myogenic mechanism, and the detection is at the afferent arterial. So in other words, if that stretches, I squeeze. If this relaxes, then well, just do the opposite, sorry. So detection is at the afferent arterial, and the action is at the afferent arterial. The other way that I monitor and change GFR is to monitor it at the distal convoluted tubule. There's a group of cells here called the juxtaglomerular cells. That's why it's called the juxtaglomerular system or feedback loop. These cells are basically detecting flow rate, and if they detect a flow rate that is too high, they're going to tell these cells to relax. If they detect a flow rate that is too low, they're going to do just the opposite. They're going to squeeze. So I'm going to change my output here by modifying the capillary diameter rather than the afferent arterial. But the effect is the same. I either get more or less flow based on whether or not I dilate or constrict. And also, of course, the monitoring location is different. I'm monitoring the fluid here, and up here, I'm monitoring the blood pressure. So with the myogenic, I'm monitoring blood pressure. With the juxtaglomerular, I'm monitoring the actual amount of fluid that's passing through. Yes?
So I'm a little confused.
Fire away.
So if the GFR rises, you dilate or constrict capillary?
So if the GFR rises, then I want to, hold on. If the GFR is on the rise, then I want to dilate. I want to relax these.
Okay. So then if it
You
falls,
told
you
us
want
you
to
want
constrict
Yeah, you
it.
told us. That's what we were trying to figure out.
Oh, I apologize. Okay, so let me work back through this. I apologize. All right, so we all got this. There's a lot of arrows going up and down here. So if I have too high, right? If my GFR is too high, basically all that means is that I have too much fluid. I have too much fluid. If my GFR is too high, I have too much fluid passing through that tube, through the distal convoluted tube. So let's actually just take stock of that. That if my GFR is noted to be too high, and again, detected by the juxtaglomerular cells, then that means I have too much fluid passing through the distal convoluted tube. So I want to reduce that fluid. The way that I reduce that fluid is to reduce the pressure here, which means to relax the pressure on those capillaries. So if I relax those, then therefore I'm not pushing as much fluid out. Now, this seems in contrast to what we mentioned earlier, because up here, we said that if we want our GFR to go up, right, if we wanted our GFR to go up with that blood vessel, what did we do to it? We relaxed it, which let more blood into here, where we're squeezing. So it's two different mechanisms. It seems opposite, but we're getting the same result. If I relax this, I get more fluid into the filtration space. But if I relax these, I actually get less filtration because now I'm not squeezing as hard on the actual spot where the filtration is taking place. Does that make sense? Think about it like a garden hose. if there's a pinhole here, okay, I can get more water. Well, we started with 2, so let's, okay. So I have too much water coming out of that hole right there in a garden hose. So the last thing I want to do is squeeze on that spot, right? I want to relax that, and so then less fluid will come out. So in terms of how much water comes out of the pinholes here, we can think about it in terms of this pinhole is going to be influenced 2 ways. How much water is passing to that point, that's this, and then how much pressure is directly on that point, that's this. Does that make sense? So that if I relax this, if I relax here, I'm going to get more fluid there, right? But if I relax here, I'm actually going to get less fluid there. So the same thing will result in different actions at the point of the pinhole. So that's why relaxation in the capillary itself will reduce GFR, and relaxation in the afferent arterial will increase GFR. Confusing, and I apologize for reversing that.
But either way, so if you relax the afferent, you're relaxing on the inside. If you're squeezing on the afferent, you're squeezing on the inside.
Say that again, sorry.
If you relax on the outside, you relax on the inside.
Not necessarily. So the only reason that I might, well, as we'll see, there are hormonal mechanisms, but when I relax out here, it will be right now based on blood pressure in the body either going up or going down. So what I do out here, squeezing or relaxing, is based on what's going on out here. Whether I squeeze or relax here is based solely on what I detect in my distal convoluted tube. So I might squeeze or relax here and change nothing there, or I might squeeze or relax here and change nothing there. Should we run through it again? No. All right, let's look at the other mechanisms. So just backing up here. Those are what we call the renal autoregulation methods. Autoregulation because there were no commands sent from an exterior tissue to the kidney. There were commands sent, but they were all within the kidney, right? These cells communicating to these cells, or the smooth muscle cells communicating to the endothelial cells. Everything was in-house. We can, though, have tissues outside of the kidney, outside of the urinary system, sending commands. So that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to go through the sympathetic mechanism first. Okay, so sympathetic. First off, let's go way back to like week 1 maybe of class and think about the differences in the parasympathetic commands of the nervous system versus the sympathetic commands of the nervous system. You may recall that we described the sympathetic commands of the nervous system as being often described as the fight or flight commands, and the parasympathetic as rest and digest. So when the sympathetic nervous system is communicating to the kidney, it's telling the kidney that it wants the kidney to reduce urine output. It wants to reduce the GFR. So sympathetic command is always going to be an attempt to do that, to lower the glomerular filtration rate. The reason for this is because, again, fight or flight, your body has determined that there's something much more important right now that we ought to be doing than making urine. We might urinate, but it doesn't want to make any new urine, right? If you're chasing a bear, your kidneys right now are not of a concern. What is of a concern is getting away from, did I say chasing a bear? It's like the opposite between inflow and outflow. We need to reverse that. Maybe you're inclined to chase it. Chased by a bear. What matters is how well it's working. We have the hamstrings and the quadriceps working efficiently. Not, hey, are we making a liter or 1.5 liters of pee-pee right now? That doesn't matter. Right? We want to divert blood flow. We want to redirect blood flow to the tissues that most immediately need that blood, that oxygen, that glucose that is contained within the bloodstream. So GFR drops because we're sacrificing, temporarily, we're sacrificing blood flow to the glomerular capillaries, and we're redirecting that blood flow to other vital tissues that need it more, or at least the sympathetic nervous system perceives that it needs it more. Notice that the mechanism is the exact same mechanism that we've already discussed, the myogenic mechanism. We do the same thing. If I want to reduce GFR, the easiest way, despite everything else that we talked about so far, the easiest way to reduce GFR is to just cut off the flow into here. Right? I can't filter blood. If I pinch this off completely, my GFR will drop to 0. I've got no blood flowing into the filtration system, therefore I'll have nothing coming out the proximal convoluted tubule. We don't shut it off completely, but in some cases, nearly so. So the sympathetic nervous system is sending commands to squeeze the afferent. Similar to our glossing over of some of the specific terms will be the adrenal epinephrine. That's the particular hormone. We won't worry about that. And so if minimally you just know that when sympathetic commands are sent to the kidney, it means that we are going to squeeze down tightly on the afferent arteriole, therefore drastically reducing how much blood comes in, therefore drastically reducing how much blood is filtered. So our GFR will drop significantly. We also need to understand, which we mentioned, the reason for that. The reason for that is, again, because we're in fight or flight, and so the nervous system has determined that, hey, we need that blood, more importantly, to go over here, which typically means to the heart, to the brain, and to your muscles.
So the renal autoregulation is basically just trying to maintain like a homeostatic
Exactly.
GFR,
Yes.
as where the sympathetic nervous system is going, is like taking control for a second.
So it's something
Okay.
environmentally is taking place, and now we really have to change the norm, basically. Other questions?
Was that why your kidneys hurt whenever you run way too long?
Ooh, I don't know. Maybe just muscle soreness. All right. Oh, look at that. Apparently, I do not have an individual slide. Let me double check. Don't see one. So let's go back to the beginning, where we started this regulation. Hormonal control. So hormonal control will be tackled over the duration of several slides. Okay, there isn't any one specific quick, here's what happens under hormonal control. It depends on the situation and the hormone that is released and how much of that particular hormone. So whereas with sympathetic control, we can say that this is what happens every single time. With hormonal control, there isn't any one specific thing that we can say that, hey, under hormonal control, this is what happens. With renal autoregulation, we could kind of parse out generally what ought to happen. With sympathetic control, we could get real specific and say this is exactly what happens. With hormonal control, it's highly variable based on which hormone is affecting the GFR at any particular time. We're going to take those hormones kind of one at a time, but not today. Right? So later on, we're going to offer more or provide more detail to exactly how hormonal control affects the GFR. So for now, I guess, just know that later we'll discuss it, and we'll leave it at that for hormonal control. That'll probably be a Thursday item. Before we move on, though, questions on the two systems that we looked at for renal autoregulation and then the sympathetic control mechanism. Questions on how those will affect GFR. All right. Moving to all right, going back here. So remember, at the beginning of this, this is all leading to how we create urine. Right? We broke it into stages. We said that there is the actual filtration process, which is what we've been talking about now. Right? We said that at the capsule, we're going to filter. And then we've got the loop, and we've got the distal convoluted tubule. So everything that we've talked about thus far is modification of what's happening here during the filtration process. We can either increase the filtration rate, decrease the filtration rate, therefore we are affecting the GFR. So that's the first step in creating urine, simply creating the filtration fluid and increasing and decreasing when we need to. Step 2 and 3, if you recall, are we can now take things out of that tube, or we can put things into that tube that might have been missed by the filtration process. And then the step 4 was water concentration, where through largely the actions of the collecting duct, we can adjust how much water is in that tube. So we've talked about 4 different steps. And so far, we have now just hit step 1 in greater detail. We talked about the filtration process, but we're getting ready to move on to steps 2, 3, and 4. We won't get very far through number 2 before we probably quit today. All right. So we're moving on to step 2. Step 2 is basically modification of the tubular fluid. We're going to focus first on tubular reabsorption and then tubular secretion. So by tubular reabsorption, here's what I mean. So we have a blood vessel that goes in. That's our afferent. We've talked about it over and over again. We've got the glomerular capillaries. They're inside there. And out comes the efferent. That efferent blood vessel then runs alongside of my proximal convoluted tubule. And I can pull things out of my proximal convoluted tubule and put it right back into the blood vessel. So that molecule, I can pull it out through filtration, and then I can put it right back in through tubular reabsorption. Remember, we said that for a male, up to 180 liters of fluid are passed into the proximal convoluted tubule per day. So that means if that little dot represents water molecules, most of them are not going to end up at the end of the line. Most of them are going to be put right back into the bloodstream. So tubular reabsorption is exactly that. It's taking things that I just filtered out and now reabsorbing them, in other words, putting them back into the bloodstream. All right, first off with some just facts. 65% of everything that I just pulled out gets almost immediately put right back in. So we just went through all that effort to pull out water and nitrogenous waste and hormones and a whole bunch of other stuff. And 65% of that material, and fluid, mostly it's just water, is put right back in to the proximal, from the proximal convoluted tubule back into the blood vessel. The cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, I kind of zoom in right here. So we have to remember this is a tube. And let's say that my little boxes here represent the cells that my PCT is made out of. And now we know that the efferent arteriole, once it leaves, it runs, I mean, it doesn't matter which side, right? I guess I drew it on top before, so I'll draw it up there again, right? The blood vessel, the efferent arteriole, runs now along the proximal convoluted tube. So if there are substances in here that I want to put back in there, then I need cells that are well equipped to engage in that action. They need to be modified to make it as efficient as possible, because this is all happening very quickly, to move molecules and water from the PCT and put it back into this blood vessel. So these are some of those modifications. The cells that line the proximal convoluted tubule are prominent in microvilli. Microvilli, chapter 3A and B1, if you recall, are when the cells have an increased surface area. They have this back and forth reticulating cell membrane that increases surface area. If I increase surface area, I can increase rates of diffusion. So anywhere where I'm ever going to absorb something in the body, microvilli are going to help me do that. They are abundant in mitochondria, also chapter 3AP1. Remember, mitochondria are the little organelles inside cells that make ATP. Some of this action will be passive. In other words, I'll move things from high to low concentration just because that's where they want to go. Some of it will be active. And so I'll have transport proteins, proteins on the surface of these cells that actively kind of vacuum up materials. And that will require ATP. Active transport needs an energy source, ATP. Mitochondria provide that. So the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule are extensive with respect to their cell surface with microvilli, and within them they have lots of mitochondria to produce ATP because they have surface proteins that act like little vacuums that are going to be pulling molecules out of the proximal convoluted tubule. And then this tells us just about, how, in terms of percentage, how important the activity of the PCT is. So we're talking about this tiny little tube, proximal convoluted tube, these tiny little tubes inside your kidney. They alone, not just the whole nephron, not the whole kidney, but just here, along the proximal convoluted tubule, 6% of your daily ATP consumption is utilized right here within the PCT. So we think about a lot of metabolically active tissues in the body, like muscle and nervous system tissue and the heart. The cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, they're working non-stop to take those molecules and put them back into your bloodstream. So collectively, their activity, the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, their activity is called tubular reabsorption. Tubular because this is the tube where the waste and the fluid, the water, and a number of other solids exist, but we want some of it back in there. So we are reabsorbing it back into the blood vessel. All right, 2 routes. Let's get even bigger here. So there's my blood vessel again. All right, these are supposed to represent 3 cells of the proximal convoluted tubule. So maybe this guy number 1, this guy number 2, and that guy number 3. I'm trying to draw it big, so all we're seeing now below those 3 cells is the interior of the proximal convoluted tubule, right? We're not even seeing the other side of the tube over there. Everybody with me? Okay. So this is actually some new terminology, but it's pretty straightforward. Transcellular route is when there is a molecule inside the PCT, and its access to the bloodstream is through a cell. In other words, it was absorbed by the cell, maybe some special protein, and it was placed inside the capillary because that molecule moved through the cell. So here it says the cytoplasm, because remember the inside of the cell is called the cytoplasm. So if we can say the molecule went into a cell, through the cell, out the other side, and into the bloodstream, it used the transcellular route. But remember, every cell, even though they may look like they're squished right up against each other, technically there is always microscopic space between cells. So there is also opportunity for molecules to move between cells and get back into the bloodstream. And that we call the paracellular route. So if a molecule moves from the PCT back into the bloodstream through a cell, transcellular. If it moves between cells and back into the bloodstream, then it is paracellular. This blood vessel, I haven't really named it yet. The name hasn't popped up on a PowerPoint slide yet, but for the first time it has. Now you have identified those capillaries in lab. When the blood vessel is running alongside the tubes, this could be the proximal convoluted tubule, this could be the loop of Henle, this could be the distal convoluted tubule, but when the blood vessel is running adjacent to the tubing of the nephron, we call it a paratubular capillary. So now we've got material going from the proximal convoluted tubule into the paratubular capillary. Peri means around, tubular because we're around these tubes, capillary because it's a blood vessel. We'll tackle that solvent drag on the next slide. Questions on those terms? Okay, let's talk about what passes through and how it gets there. So, as it says here, sodium is the key for reabsorption. I suspect many of you already in the nursing industry, the health profession, already understand how important it is to monitor and know what those sodium levels are. We've talked about sodium levels so many different times with respect to action potentials, right? Having sodium moving in and out of the cell membrane to control action potentials. Not going back to the action potentials, but here's another location where sodium is critical to a particular homeostatic mechanism, in this case, our glomerular filtration rate. So before we tackle that slide, we need to revisit something from, again, AMP1, called secondary active transport. Secondary active transport, so this is setting up for that discussion over there. Secondary active transport would be where I have a group of cells that are meant to absorb some molecule type in some space. So you can think of this as the proximal convoluted tubule. So these cells, their job is to grab some molecule and absorb it. If there is a high concentration of those molecules, let's just say glucose, because glucose will be an important one. If there is a high concentration of glucose there, and I'm wanting to put that glucose back into the bloodstream, and there is a low concentration of glucose there, my job is made easier, right? Because now I can just rely on simple diffusion. But if there are 100 glucose molecules here, and I want all 100 of them to go there, can I rely on diffusion alone? No, because at some point in time, I'm going to hit 50-50, and then diffusion is of no use to me because I don't have a concentration gradient any longer. But I want all those glucose molecules. So here's what these cells can do. They can and do pump sodium, so Na+, sodium, they pump sodium into this environment. So they purposefully concentrate sodium on this side. And as glucose becomes more and more depleted, right? I'm getting closer and closer to that 50-50. As glucose becomes more and more depleted, well, now I can't use passive transport, I can't use high to low anymore. But what I can use is what are called symport proteins. Proteins that collect molecules if they come in 2 at a time. You have what are called sodium, glucose, transport proteins. In other words, it will only allow a molecule to come in if they are paired together, if they come in together. So where does this sodium want to go? If I'm really highly concentrating it in here, it wants to come back out, right? The glucose, not so much. But the sodium has such a high concentration here that it will basically pull glucose along with it. And that is secondary active transport. Here's why secondary. Does the sodium out here require energy to come back in there? Ignoring everything else that I just said. If I have a high concentration of sodium here, does it need energy to go inside that cell? No, no energy is required. But how did I concentrate that sodium here? I pumped it. And does pumping require energy? It does. So the absorption of the sodium and the glucose is technically a passive process at this point, but it required energy back here to concentrate my sodium. We do this with all kinds of molecules. I'm just using glucose as an example here, but we'll capture all kinds of molecules by basically having special proteins that will take sodium and then you just name it. What else do you want, right? So we'll pump enough sodium in there that we'll get those other molecules by pulling. There's such a strong attraction for sodium to come in that sodium will drag along other molecules with it. The silly example that I give for secondary active transport in ANP1, if you may, I don't know, so you might remember, sand in a boat. Right? Imagine that you have sand in a boat and you want to get it out. Well, most boats have a drain plug. And so one easy way to get the sand out of your boat instead of vacuuming or sweeping is fill your aluminum boat, let's say, with water, and then pull the plug. Well, the water is going to start streaming out of there, and it's going to start pulling the sand along with it. So once I pull the plug, I'm not using energy to clean out my boat, right? The water's drawing the sand out. But I did have to pump H2O into my boat. So I had to use energy back here to then get this process to occur. So that is called secondary active transport. We can do it with different molecules. In other words, we can concentrate different molecules, but typically the kidney is going to use sodium. It's going to pump into your proximal convoluted tubule. It's going to pump a whole bunch of sodium so that sodium will attach to other molecules like glucose, and then I get them both going back into the bloodstream. Okay, well, we're not quite done, but that'll be our stopping point for today, so that I can